Hi, I'm Jason Leggett, and today I'll be talking about copyright and how that relates to law and society. And I want you to think a little bit about education in general, how the information is delivered to you, what we are allowed to share with you, and what is protected under copyright law. Many students don't know, for example, that their $100 plus textbooks are actually protected under copyright law. And there is some question as to why that is, provided that most of those textbooks, from my own research, appear to simply copy what you could otherwise find on public available sources, especially as those related to government and to classes that are of general knowledge. On the other hand, there are published works, notably books, that have copyright protection so that other people can't claim that they came up with those ideas. So kind of who gets access to what generally depends on what institution you have, how much money you have. And so there's far-reaching implications for how copyright law extends beyond just what is considered intellectual property. So we just want to kind of start with the two basic questions. Because law can be interpreted, and we're going to see that in copyright law, who decides how law is applied and who should decide are very important questions. So the simplest answer to the first question is judges. They decide, either through legal disputes, through case law, or through something called stare decisis, precedents from previous legal cases. Now, who should decide is a much more complicated question. Judges decide law under a public system of government, and what is commonly referred to as separation of powers. It was famously Justice John Marshall that said that it was the province of the court to decide what the law is. However, that kind of older system, and that system really does date back to the Middle Ages. We obviously live in a much different kind of system now, which with a much larger emphasis on democracy, or improving the idea that more people can participate in decision making. So in this particular issue, when it comes to property law of the intellect or of creative works that are could possibly be given property ownership to a particular individual, we want to think about what stake should the artist have, what stake should consumers have or viewers, and what stake should corporations or the government have. So we start off with a pretty basic sketch, and this is a very handy comparison. From the left to the right here, you'll see what I would describe, just looking at the screen, on the left-hand side as a smiley face with big eyes, and then two ears that resemble a cartoon character from the Disney Corporation. So if I look over at that Disney character, I recognize it as Mickey Mouse pretty distinctively from my childhood, from visiting Disneyland, from watching Disney movies, etc. So if I just think about, does the Disney Corporation, are they identified with that image on the right? I think everyone would agree, yes. I think very few people wouldn't know what that image was. On the other hand, the image to the left is from a performing artist from a genre of music that I don't really know much about. And I don't know that many people would know what this image is or who it represents. So on the one hand, you look at it and say, well, the information it's conveying, the symbol is conveying, is not being confused generally with Mickey Mouse. On the other hand, if I just look at it from the geometric shapes, it's pretty close. There are very minor differences, and from a distance, you could confuse it, and you could make the argument that this is the backside of the Disney cartoon character. So again, law is open to interpretation, and so we'd want to know, well, how does stare decisis, or how does legal history, what does it have to say? So a famous statement, and this comes from a book called Free Culture by Lawrence Lessig, but it's also a common reference in law school classes. The book Free Culture, by the way, by Lawrence Lessig, is not necessarily trying to make an argument for or against copyright law, as much as it's showing how copyright law has really been changed since the 1970s, and to some extent from the 1920s to the 1970s, the development of the profit margins, right? Just the fact that, for example, the Disney Corporation made so much money, and really arguing that, if the same copyright laws were applied today, the Disney Corporation would not have been able to make that money because they would have violated the copyright law of performers like Buster Keaton and others. I mean, they also use a lot of classical music, if you notice, in their movies. And so there's some kind of a contradiction and a little bit of hypocrisy in the way that the corporate structure, and these are board of directors and these are CEOs, how they're using copyright law today and how they're lobbying in government, that really goes against kind of the purpose of copyright law as it kind of historically stands. So in English legal history, which of course influences the United States system dramatically, the quote is pretty straightforward. The person may use the copy by playing it, and that's really the end of it. So you're able to use, and this does, this is really the basis of it. The idea is kind of that you use it once. Now, of course, it wasn't as easy to copy, using digital technology in the past. So there is some debate that would be warranted just as to how should this concept be applied today. Now, the violation of copyright comes in the second part of this sentence, which is he has no right to rob the author of the profit by multiplying copies and disposing them for his own use. So it makes it seem here that the idea is that you can use something that somebody else has already produced, but you can't benefit. You can't profit by that, by duplicating it, by sharing it, by getting others to participate in the use of it. So in other words, it's a very private, exclusive kind of right to the person producing it. And then it's a private, but in a different sense private, and it's not so much as a right as it's a privilege to use that item. So we get back to the interesting depiction of a mouse by two different authors. And I just want to highlight the different legal strategies that each side took. So Disney attempted to block the use of Dead Mouse's trademark application, saying that it was too similar. Basically, it's not a creative or original art. On the other hand, Dead Mouse responds with the cease and desist letter, indicating that there's some disagreement about how they're perceiving the image itself. So oftentimes I'd refer to this in class as the conflict of laws. The law seems to support both sides, and yet, they're using legal tactics to kind of block the other side from using the piece of property that they're claiming. So the point here is that it's rather confusing, and we want to kind of attribute that to the law itself. The copyright law is not a very clear, predictable, and patterned, reasoned out kind of concept here. It has been changed over time, and that leads to some of the confusion. So oftentimes students and lay people, people who are not lawyers, right, that when they think about the law, what they really mean is legislation. I want to highlight why that's unusual, or why there's a distinction within lawyers and judges, is really just a concept of legal history. Really, up until the 1920s, courts, judges, and average citizens were highly suspicious of public law or of legislatures. I think the most famous example of this comes in the Federalist Papers, and just the concept that there's kind of guarantee after guarantee to the anti-federalists that there isn't going to be a massive amount of congressional legislation that's going to override state laws. And yet, as we know today, that's exactly what has happened. So I just want to kind of highlight the idea that courts and lawyers are inherently suspicious of legislation. In other words, they're looking for defects in the law. Something that lay people and students often take for granted. They think, well, that's the law. But in court, the law is very much open to interpretation. So we want to focus on this first line here. It says the Copyright Act gives exclusive rights. And so that means that the person who owns the copyright has all of the rights attributed to that piece of work. So I think probably the thing that's hardest for students to think about is when they reference their own Facebook account. I might highlight that I do not have a Facebook account. not necessarily for this reason, but I think the idea here is that the use of copyrighted materials on a program, an application like Facebook is really not well monitored, and many times you have no idea that you're sharing property that has exclusive rights to somebody else. And so if you just look at this displaying a photographic image by using a computer to fill a computer screen of a copy, you know, people are doing this pretty regularly, which means that you're in violation of copyright law. So I just highlight, just to make you not, panic, is that there is the old adage that it's better to ask forgiveness than ask permission. Clearly, you're not trying to do this to make a profit, and clearly you're not trying to do this to rob the author of their exclusive copyright. However, if you were to increase your likes and if you were able to get a certain measure of popularity or reputation via Facebook or another social media website, and that led to, say, a job or something else, an argument could be made that you were benefiting from sharing that copyrighted material. Oftentimes I hear, especially by smart people, but I have a defense, or there's the fair use doctrine, or I'm not benefiting financially from this. Well, I could just make a comparison to what some people expect also in criminal law. Right? They say, well, that person who ate the brains of their victim is crazy. Well, that may or may not be true. I mean, crazy is a very difficult term to define, as lawyers and psychologists will confirm. But, more importantly, it doesn't change the fact that you'd be guilty of murder. You have a defense that might be used in sentencing, right, to try to give you some kind of a different sentence. However, it doesn't mean that you didn't do the murder. And in this case, just because you have a defense doesn't mean you didn't do the copyright infringement. So I think in general, if you wanted to be safe and not violate the law, you simply just would not repost anything. I would also probably avoid liking anything for that matter. And I think, Instagram is a particularly scary one because people don't exactly make a very clear distinction between what is their image and what is an image they may have gotten from somewhere else. And I used to work with photographers, and this comes up quite a lot. So again, I think if you just wanted to be safe, you wouldn't really participate at all. And then if you do, you could put some kind of disclaimer saying that this isn't yours. But again, that's something you're going to have to prove as a defense at trial. So, I say this somewhat sarcastically, but I do mean it. I hope you have the money, because that's going to be quite an expensive endeavor. So I go back to the kind of main point of this whole thing, which is the law is open to interpretation, and one might ask, should it be? So we go through the basics of why the law is interpretive. And, the simplest concept is that, well, laws are not made by everyone, and they're not made by a perfect human. So they're really just made and enforced by one group against another set of group, or another set of groups, right? And not necessarily with any malicious intent. Sometimes it is, but other times it's just really not, they're just trying to protect what's theirs against a imagined other. So in this case, copyright law has really been, hijacked is the word that comes to mind. I think that's fair, by corporate interests, recording studios, these big corporations like Disney that own, nearly 80% of the media and keep buying more and more. So, it becomes kind of a underdog scenario here where if you're a small artist, you face the chance of being sued. I think the second thing you want to think about, I find this a lot. People wish the law was, the law, like that's the law. But it isn't. And I don't know how to really describe this belief as anything other than just kind of naive, a little bit juvenile, a little bit, when you're young, sure, you think of it like this way, but it's just not the way the real world operates. And so to just kind of stand on the sidelines and say, well, too bad, or I'll just try not to do it. When you think of like just the basic thing of sharing a movie or sharing music, again, sharing pictures, you could really get in trouble for this. And even people like, who are beloved by Democrats, Joseph Biden, who is the vice president and the United States Senator, he has, ferociously advocated for locking young people up for violating this law, and most famously the 1997 Net Act, which makes it a crime, and you could serve time or pay a really enormous fine. So there's all sorts of crazy cases out there. A baby has been sued for dancing to a Prince song. Lots of kids have been threatened with lawsuits or with jail time, for stealing music. And then probably most notoriously, we've got Napster and Pirate Bay that have been both shut down and or taken over by the government, law enforcement, to monitor who's using it. So then I want to just kind of think about some big things that we want to think about in the entire semester. Or if you're just watching this on your own, what you want to think about just generally about the law. The first one is a basic political economy point of view, which is some people argue that the law should be predictable, stable, and efficient. Well, if that's so, then this particular law is definitely not that. Probably the largest offense I hear is how come I'm able to do it, right? And I think this is very logical the more you get to understand property law, because you really don't have a secret. For example, in trade secrets, you really don't have the right to argue that your sheep are yours if you don't, put them under lock and key, if you don't have a fence, if you're not trying to protect your property. So the ease of which individuals are able to share this information or this media does suggest that there's a huge inefficiency here. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody should steal everything. I'm just saying that if you believe that the law should be predictable, stable, and efficient, you should be advocating for some kind of reform as to copyright law. The next category is social justice, and this is, I think a perfectly fine attitude to have in general, and I think my only criticism is that it's overused. Because whose social justice are we talking about? I think the corporations would argue that justice would be that these people who are stealing without permission should be punished. I think that the underdog would say that they want a fighting chance to remix or reuse or change up or make it new, as the literature modernist said. What could be very stale, boring information in media. I mean, I personally like the old Disney movies, but not everybody does. And, Disney seems to be making the same thing over and over and over again. So why not let, some young person try and remake something? I might give an example of an old myth that comes from a blacksmith beating the devil, which reminds me of the devil and Daniel Webster, another old myth. And a young person under the age of 25 remade that story into a film, and I thought it was quite good. So I think this idea that copyright should only protect those with property interests is a little one-sided. So I think when people are talking about social justice, this is kind of what they mean, that there should be some equity, there should be some way to enforce the law in a way that doesn't just, benefit the super rich. That then also leads us to this idea is, should the law be the law? So should it be enforced without exception, or are there cases in which we would want to grant exceptions? And I think, again, that goes back to, well, who decides? Is that the next question, is that a majority vote? Is that democracy? Is that judges? Is that legislators? Is that lawyers? Is it corporations? Is it artists? I think of the very annoying position that the band Metallica has taken in what arguably is music that is not unique to them. So I think, it's just really hard, depending on what point of view you're taking, as to who gets to decide these exceptions. I want to close with an example just directed kind of towards the generation that's entering college now, and I want to highlight a few different things here. I think, the first thing is the obvious thing at the very beginning. File sharing is a crime, regardless of how many people, young people, are doing it. And so, I think the other thing is that it's clear you have the No Electronic Theft Act. Like I said, it's called the Net Act. And, it's been used. So the law kind of is pretty clear, but conduct and habit and the way that we're living seem to be in direct contradiction of that law. Then I think the big question here is, since I think we're pretty familiar now with what the crime is how did this person get caught? And in class, I hear lots of different answers, and I think they're really interesting, mainly because they show the belief system that young people have today about how surveillance works. And I think definitely after the World Trade Center attack, people are paranoid that everything that they're doing is being watched. And in some ways that's true. However, we are mostly talking about computer programs that are phishing for data, that we're not talking about individuals that are watching other individuals. So I think the interesting thing here is, how did this person get caught? And the answer is the college reported them. So I think another thing students don't know is, somebody who is watching them are universities. So when you step onto the college property and you utilize their wireless network or you use their computers, that information is being monitored, and some people say that that's really important. However, I think if you were to think about it from a Supreme Court point of view, the amount of individuals that are being surveyed who are not doing anything illegal and who you would have no reasonable suspicion or probable cause to search is enormous. And the handful of people that may be doing something illegal, maybe not, maybe they're doing something that the school doesn't like, but it's still not illegal, may also not have probable cause or reasonable suspicion. And so this kind of general phishing that happens over computer networks is highly suspicious. But I might point out, and this is really relevant to the constitutional law class I teach, it's going to take lawsuits for that to change, or a huge amount of public pressure, which is unlikely. But in this case, you see that this individual was turned over to the FBI by the university computer managers. And they were really tracking traffic, right? So they were just saying, well, there seems to be one area, one set of computers that are basically downloading a lot of content. What is this content? Really none of their business if you think about it, right? It starts to make me nervous that anytime I access the Kingsborough website and I start downloading articles that I'm doing research on, is someone going to look at the content and say, well, I don't think he should be researching that, so I'm going to go ahead and turn him into somebody. Not to mention that, things could be fabricated. So if I get into an argument with somebody in IT and they decide that they want to set me up for something, there's really not much stopping me stopping them, from doing this to me. And there's really not much I can do in response. So I think this goes back to that idea of surveillance and kind of just technology is we're not sure what to do. So legal history doesn't quite give us a good, clear idea of what to do. Finally, I think I just want to make this point, and this is Lawrence Lessig makes this point, and I don't think this is really all that controversial anymore. Maybe in the 90s this might have been, something that could be debated, but now I think it's pretty clear. Copyright has been hijacked by corporate elites, and they just want to protect their property. The clearest, most vulgar example of this is that they keep going back wanting to extend copyright protection. And I might highlight the fact that one of the framers, Ben Franklin, wasn't even for copyright. So, there's been two sides to this, and maybe three if you think about the people who really just don't care. But there's, been very clear opposition to the idea that anyone should have exclusive right over a picture, over a movie, over a book. And I think, there's room for disagreement, and there's room for debate, and there's room for change here. So this is probably an issue, and you're seeing it more and more with the United States and China. This is probably an issue that's going to come up quite a bit in the next 30, 40 years. I think the idea here, I would agree with Lawrence Lessig, is that we need some form of remix, right? We're not getting rid of copyright. It doesn't seem very realistic since it's been around so long. And huge media corporations are built on this. I think the idea here is, are younger people going to continue to resist by just violating the law? Are government officials really going to go out and arrest people en masse? Is there a possibility for some kind of shared view of justice here? I think without the idea of a remix, without some kind of change, and you can go to Creative Commons if you want to see what this looks like, I think probably not. And then that has far-reaching implications for education and what we're able to use. And do I get credit for the work that I do? Do I get credit for the slideshow? Can somebody just use it? I'd say yes, I don't care, like go ahead and share this with other people. But maybe if I was, a biologist or a physicist and I was coming up with a new theory, I might want to get some credit for this work, especially if it meant that I was going to get to keep my job because of it. So again, I think that there's a lot of room, and this just is one more way of highlighting that the law is interpretive, and there's ways that people can look at it.